Welcome back, everybody, to another episode of Counting on Chazin. This is the series that helps nonprofit organizations understand how their accounting can actually help them achieve their mission, vision, and values in a lot easier, more compliant, and actually, dare I say, natural way. And we have Martha Huelsbeck back with us, CPA, the talent and recruiting development manager for Chazin Company. We are going to ask her a whole bunch of questions today about NICRA. Really an interesting concept. I've got to say, Martha, I did not know about this until I met with you off camera and you brought this up. And I was like, holy moly, we need to do an episode just on this topic because it's pretty significant, isn't it?
It can be, yeah. Depending on your source of funding, this can be a big, can be a big deal in terms of your costs.
Well, let's dig in because we have so many questions for you. And I got to say, what the heck is NICRA? What does it stand for?
So NICRA is an acronym that stands for Negotiated Indirect Cost Rate Agreement. That's an agreement between a nonprofit organization and the federal government about what your overhead rate is that you can charge on federally funded programs.
Wow. Okay, so let's back up a little bit and then talk to me or remind me what indirect cost actually means.
So indirect costs are costs that are not directly traceable to the program that you're delivering. So for example, if you're a food bank, the cost of the food that you provide is a direct cost of providing that service. Indirect costs, on the other hand, might be a building where you're co-located with other programs, or it may be your top leadership who manages both the food bank program and some other programs. So it's really costs that's shared across different programs, and therefore we call it indirect.
Awesome. You know, that helps me out so much because it helps me. Chazin Company has me now thinking in like a ledger spreadsheet mentality, I got to say. And I'm thinking, okay, now I see where this is going to go. You started off this conversation with us by saying that this is really going to be more applicable with organizations that are dealing with federal government grants. Did I hear that correctly?
Yeah, where there are federal funds as the source of those grants.
Federal funds. Okay. So talk to us then about this piece called sources and origination. What does that look like?
Well, there are a lot of grants that come through that do not come directly from the federal government that may have a federally funded source. The most common place you see that is in state and municipal grants, but you also sometimes will see what I would call sort of a step down grant where another nonprofit or even a for-profit got a grant or a contract from the federal government, and they're bringing in a nonprofit organization to deliver a portion of that program. So you really need to understand the original source of the funds, not just who you signed a grant agreement with.
Wow, that's a pretty heavy duty concept. Do you think that that's something that most nonprofits understand, like coming forward with this, or is that something that they're going to have to dig in a little bit more on?
No, that's something that you have to dig in on, and most of them don't understand it. I've worked with several organizations and we talk about how much federal funding they have, and it's, the direct agreements with the federal government where, you start looking at state and local grants and you realize that those are pass-throughs from federal funds.
Wow, so it's a little bit of a tracing, tracking kind of process that you really need to understand up front, I would imagine, well before you've entered into any of these other agreements. Would that be fair to say?
Well, it's nice to know up front, but it doesn't necessarily happen that way. Sometimes the request for proposal or whatever advertising that the grant has will actually identify the source of funds, and sometimes that's a good place to go back and figure this out. But it's hard, and sometimes the granting organization has to go back and figure it out themselves. I've seen that with state grants where the state has to go back and say, wait a minute, or a national organization that's passing down funds to state organizations within their nonprofit structure, and they have to go back and say, yeah, lots of confusion. Anything that is awarded in the District of Columbia, because then we have sort of a federal state, and then so there's a lot of confusion that you really do need to dig into.
Okay, so now let's go the other direction. What if you are working with a grant and you don't, and there's a federal funding source, but you don't have an agreement, a NICRA agreement? What do you do then?
Well, depending on the terms of the agreement, there are grants, federally funded grants, where overhead cannot be charged, and it's called out in the grant agreement itself, and it's also typically called out when the request for proposal is put out. There's another option, which is to use a de minimis rate, which is a 10% rate that can be applied against direct costs in order to capture some overhead costs when you're doing this work.
Wow.
So there may be an option to go de minimis, and if there is, that's certainly better than zero.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. Now, you just threw out de minimis, then throw in another piece of vocabulary, cognizant agency. What is that, and how does this impact what we're talking about this morning?
Well, depending on the source of your federal funds, you would be negotiating potentially with a different agency in the US government. So if most of your funds are coming through the Department of Agriculture, then you're negotiating with them or with their designated, sometimes federal agencies will outsource some of the work within the government. But you have to know who's cognizant over you, and it's based on where the majority of your federal funds are coming from. So that's something you have to establish before you can establish an overhead rate with the government, is you have to know who you're going to negotiate with.
Okay, wow. This is getting more and more, dare I say, tangled. And before I go much further with this, I've got to believe that this is outside the wheelhouse of most nonprofits, that they're going to have to work with their accounting provider to get this information. And I know we'll drill down a little bit more on that, but it's not just a quick thing that you whip up and say, okay, send it off, is it?
No, it's not. In fact, there are a number of organizations that do accounting work for nonprofits that do not do NICRAs because it's confusing, and you don't necessarily do one every week, so it becomes kind of a specialty. But there are lots of situations where the benefits are worth the cost to actually pursue this and have it done professionally. I have to give the federal government credit. There are a number of good resources available, and it varies by agency in order to try to put one of these together yourself. But it is pretty tedious, and there's lots of rules to make sure you follow.
Well, it makes sense. And again, this is another kind of curveball question. And I'm thinking the organizations, we go back to our fictitious food bank, the food banks that understand this and can navigate this process, they probably have more funding opportunities than those that don't. Would that be a fair assessment?
Well, there is certain kind of funding where you have to have a negotiated rate in order to charge overheads. So that's definitely an advantage. There's also, depending on the scope of your federal funding, being able to recover overhead costs on your federal grants can be really important. I mean, if you're, nearly 100% grant funded, federally funded, and you don't have any overhead recovery, then, eventually you're going to run out of money because there is going to be overhead costs that you can't directly apply to your grant programs.
Yeah.
And that's the whole idea, is that there is a cost of doing business that's not necessarily directly related, to delivering on these programs. So how do you recover that cost in order to keep doing the good work that you're there to do?
Right. I appreciate that you brought that up. So talk to us about what those total cost inputs might look like. Like, what are we talking about here?
Well, typically to deliver any program, there's, labor. That's often your number one cost. Although in our food bank, food may be your number one cost. It kind of depends on the structure. There's sometimes there's work that you actually bring in another organization to help you do. Maybe there's some work around in a food bank setting. There may be some printed materials, so you actually bring in a printer to help you do those kinds of things. So really, your total cost inputs to any program are all the costs of actually, producing or delivering on that program. So it's not just the people, but it's any other direct costs that you have that enable you to successfully deliver.
Yeah, successfully deliver is a big, big thing. Okay, now you've really kind of, I want to put my hair on fire today with this concept, because whenever I hear something that is such a new concept, but it should not be, I'm concerned. I'm concerned for the sector because, to your point, I'm hearing you say that a lot of folks don't really understand this or work with this structure when they should be. So if we could kind of talk about a little bit of strategy, how do we figure these things out? How do we start? It's a pretty substantial concept.
Right. So I think the first thing you need to do is you need to look across your organization at your current funding, and then also think about, your future, where you have identified that you will get your future funding from, and look at the percentage of that is going to come from, federally originating programs. So if you're 90% contribution funded and 10% grant funded, there's a little less focus on how do I recover my overhead, because typically contributions will often cover overhead costs.
Right.
So that's the first thing you really have to do, is you need to look at the impact of, your funding sources on sort of the overall picture of how you recover the costs. Mm-hmm. So that's strategic. And then the other thing you need to do is, as you've probably deduced at this point, there's a fair bit of tedious work that goes into getting one of these proposals together, and then you negotiate it. And so you have to think about how often you're going to renegotiate. And that's, depending on the structure of your costs, whether something's changing, you might want to renegotiate. But on the other hand, then you have to go through the work of doing it again.
So if you can kind of let's go back to our fictitious food bank. How long of a process should we allot for this? I mean, this isn't just so many grants are like you hear about them on a Thursday and the material's due on Monday, right? This isn't one of those things. You've got to really step back and afford yourself some time to get this done.
You do. And organizations who are tuned into their costs, and organizations that are audited and have been audited recently, it's going to be a lot easier because they're used to sort of pulling financial data together on a regular basis. If this is your first ever federal grant that you're going to apply for, I have to say that typically you cannot get yourself a NICRA in time to apply for a program that's already been announced. It just doesn't happen that quickly, okay, because there's time involved in getting everything together to apply, and then there's also time involved at the federal agency when they're reviewing the proposal and negotiating with you.
Okay.
There are some grants that will allow you to update your budget and your overhead costs if you subsequently get a NICRA, but a number of those grants say, whatever you have in place at the time you are awarded the grant, that's the overhead that will be applied for the life of the grant.
So almost it seems in a strategic with a strategic lens, you as an organization, as a nonprofit, have to be on the path of working with more federal grants, federal funding. Is that fair to say? And then you arm yourself with the different tools, NICRA being one of those primary tools.
Right. So if you've used a federal grant, special funds that have come through for recovery recently or something like that, and you don't anticipate that will become sort of a permanent part of your funding structure, then it's probably not worth the effort to go through and negotiate an agreement. If this is your structure and you've never had a NICRA, then you definitely want to be thinking about it and doing some analysis, with a professional to decide, if the benefits are going to outweigh the costs of pulling this together. So,
Right.
and it usually happens kind of over time. I had an organization a couple of months ago that said, okay, I think we're ready to go on this. We're going to do it. They've been thinking about it for 3 years.
So, part of what NICRA stands for, that first word is negotiated. And before I let you go today, I've got to ask you this. Is it truly negotiated? Or is it just like you fill out the paperwork and you send it in and hopefully you get the stamp? Or is there ever a dialogue where you communicate, well, hey, in our community, these costs might be at a different rate than, say, another part of the U.S.? I mean, is there a give and take, an actual negotiation on this?
Well, the negotiation is really more about the inputs to the proposal than it is about, hey, we think you need a little more than this. It's not. It doesn't really happen. It's a pretty mechanical process.
Okay.
But there are definitely questions that come back when you propose, like, hey, this cost looks like it should not be included. There are certain costs that cannot be included in overhead rates, like advertising, for example.
Right.
So there are those kinds of things where they'll come back and they'll say, hey, this looks like it's advertising. And then you explain, well, it's not. And they're like, well, it's close enough. So you got to pull that out. So there's sort of a negotiation over the details is where I've seen it happen.
Okay, good. Well, that's an interesting thing, because and you think about federal, municipal, county, regional documentation. A lot of times there's not an opportunity to really negotiate. You kind of have to do it or not, take it or not. And so that's, I think, what spurned on my question to you, thinking about our little food bank somewhere doing the work of the angels. How are they going to actually navigate this? What an interesting topic. And I really appreciate you, Martha, bringing us up to speed on this, because it's such it sounds to me like it's such a foundational decision in understanding how you as a nonprofit can navigate forward with some of these federal fundings. And we mentioned this earlier, and we have on other episodes of Counting on Chazin, these funding sources are really becoming more and more prevalent, maybe is the word. You mentioned the Recovery Act. I mean, there's a lot of money out there that is being introduced to nonprofits, and they have to be able to manage the process, I guess.
Yeah, it's a little different landscape than it was 5 years ago, I think, for many nonprofits. So.
Yeah, and I love how you phrase that. I think you're absolutely right. The landscape has changed, and it is changing. So, it's something that we need to be up on. Well, Martha Huelsbeck, CPA, amazing talent. You always give us an achievable way to look at things and to understand how our nonprofits can be more successful, more viable in achieving our mission, vision, and values. I'm Julia Patrick, CEO of the American Nonprofit Academy. I'm so delighted that you could join us today for another episode of Counting on Chazin. We have a lot more information. You can go to countingonchazin.com, chazinandcompany.com, where we have a lot more resources that will help you and your organization truly be successful in the work that you are pursuing. Martha, thank you so much.
You're welcome.